still, his posture deceptively calm, a stark contrast to the storm raging behind his eyes. The flickering fluorescent light overhead cast shifting shadows across his face, a face that had been splashed across television screens for years as a war hero, a philanthropist, a pillar of the community. Now, it was the face of a man under arrest. Across from him, Detective Harrison Chase, young but with a weary wisdom in his gaze, slid a photograph across the scratched metal surface. Drew didn't need to look. He had already memorized every pixel of the image, a ghost that had haunted him for weeks before it ever saw the light of day. "Tell me about this, Mr. Kane," Chase said, his voice level, devoid of accusation, which somehow made it worse. It was the voice of a man simply assembling facts, building a wall brick by brick. Drew's eyes finally lowered to the photograph. It was a grainy, black and white surveillance still, lifted from a decades-old security tape from a bank in a small, war-torn country most people in Port Charles couldn't find on a map. It showed a younger version of himself, his hair shorter, his body leaner, harder, the look in his eyes one of feral survival. He was handing a sealed envelope to a man whose face was partially obscured by shadows but was unmistakably Armand Rosales, a known financier of terror and conflict, a man responsible for atrocities that still gave nightmares to intelligence operatives. "It's not me," Drew said, the lie feeling like sand in his mouth. It was a mantra he'd been repeating to himself, to his lawyer, to his family, but here, under the unblinking eye of the recording device in the corner of the room, it sounded hollow, pathetic. "Facial recognition software puts the probability at 98.7%, Chase countered gently, tapping a folder beside him. "We have bank records, wire transfers. A significant sum of money was moved from an account linked to Rosales to an offshore shell corporation that our forensic accountants have traced back to you. This wasn't a one-time thing, Drew. This was a pattern. This was business." The word business hung in the air, ugly and final. This was the terrible secret, the cancer that had been growing in the dark corners of his past, now metastasized and exposed for all to see. It hadn't been a slow leak, a rumor whispered in the halls of General Hospital or at the Metro Court. It had been a bomb, detonated with surgical precision on the front page of the Invader under a headline so loud it felt like a physical blow, hero or traitor? Drew Kane's blood money secret exposed. He could still see the look on Carly's face when she'd seen it. They had been in the middle of a meeting about the Aurora Media merger, sunlight streaming into his office, the future looking brighter than it had in years. She had picked up her buzzing phone, her face a mask of casual curiosity that first melted into confusion, then hardened into a disbelieving horror. She hadn't said a word. She just turned the screen toward him, and in that moment, the foundation of the life he had so painstakingly rebuilt after his years of captivity and memory loss crumbled into dust. "I have no memory of that," Drew said now, shifting his strategy. It was the truth, a fractured and complicated truth. "As you know, detective, I spent years as a prisoner, my memory erased, my identity stripped. The man in that photo, he's a stranger to me." Chase leaned back, lacing his fingers over his stomach. "I've read your file, Mr. Kane. I know about Jason Morgan, the memory mapping, the whole, unbelievable story. And I sympathize, I truly do. But the courts deal in evidence. And the evidence we have is very, very clear. This transaction," he tapped the photo again, "happened after you were recovered by the Navy. After your official debriefing. This wasn't the act of a brainwashed prisoner. This was the act of a willing participant." Drew closed his eyes, the fight draining out of him. Chase was right. This was the part of the story the public didn't have yet, the part that would seal his fate. The initial leak had been bad enough, but the DA's case was built on a timeline that proved conscious, deliberate treason. He had been home. He had been debriefed. And then, he had gone back. The newsroom at the Invader was in a state of controlled chaos, the kind that only existed when a story of this magnitude was breaking. Reporters were shouting into phones, fingers flying across keyboards, the air electric with a perverse kind of glee. At the epicenter of it all was Nina Reeves, though her involvement was a secret known only to her and one other person. She stood in her office at Crimson, watching the coverage on a muted television, a knot of anxiety and vindication tightening in her chest. It had started with a whisper, a tip from a shadowy, untraceable source that had landed in Martin Gray's lap. a source that Nina, in a moment of pure, unadulterated fury, had set into motion. She had wanted to hurt Sonny and Carly, to expose their hypocrisy, to make them pay for their lies and for keeping her from her grandson. Uncovering the truth about Drew's past had seemed like a weapon too perfect to ignore. She hadn't known it would lead to this. She hadn't pictured the handcuffs, the perp walk, the utter destruction of a man's life. She had only seen it as a scandal, a humiliation for the high and mighty Carly Corinthos and her new golden boy. Seeing Drew's face, pale and stoic, on the screen now, a wave of nausea washed over her. This was more than a scandal. This was a ruin. And she was its architect. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was Valentine. She let it go to voicemail. She couldn't talk to him, not now. He would see the guilt written all over her face. Her mind raced back to the series of decisions that had led here. The furtive meetings with Martin, the coded language, the transfer of funds to secure the evidence. She had been so careful, so sure she was insulated. But watching Drew being led into the PCPD, she felt the first cold trickle of fear. Secrets in Port Charles had a way of bubbling to the surface, and this one was a volcano. At General Hospital, the usual controlled chaos of the shift change had been replaced by a stunned, hushed tension. The break room television was tuned to the news, and a crowd of nurses, orderlies, and even a few doctors had gathered, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid fascination. Elizabeth Webster stood slightly apart, her arms crossed tightly over her scrubs, her coffee forgotten and growing cold on the counter. She watched the screen, seeing the ghost of a man she had once loved, a man she had fought to save, being publicly eviscerated. She remembered Drew from those early, fragile days after his return, the confusion, the pain, the fundamental decency that had shone through even when he didn't know his own name. The man they were describing on television, the mercenary, the traitor, wasn't the Drew she knew. But then, how well had any of them ever really known him? "I can't believe it," Sabrina Santiago whispered beside her, her hand over her heart. "He always seemed so noble." "That's the point, isn't it?" muttered a cynical intern. "The best covers are the ones you don't even have to try to maintain." Elizabeth turned away, unable to watch any longer. She thought of his son, Scout, and felt a fresh wave of anguish. How do you explain this to a child? How do you tell them that the world their father built for them was funded by blood money? She found herself walking toward the nurse's station, her feet carrying her on autopilot. She picked up the phone, her fingers hovering over the keypad. She wanted to call someone, to offer comfort, but who? Carly? The two of them had a complicated history, and her allegiance was firmly with Jason. But Drew. Drew was a friend. A good man caught in a nightmare. She put the phone down. There was nothing to say. Not yet. In the waiting area of the PCPD, Carly Corinthos was a tornado of contained fury. She paced the worn linoleum floor, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm of pure rage. Her phone was pressed to her ear, her voice a low, furious hiss. "I don't care what it costs, John. You get him out of there." "No." She listened for a moment, her jaw tightening. "No, that's not good enough. They're painting him as a monster. This is a witch hunt." She ended the call and slammed the phone into her purse. Michael sat on a hard plastic chair, his face pale, his hands clasped between his knees. "Mom, yelling at his lawyer isn't going to help. We need to be smart about this." "Smart?" Carly whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "They have him in a cage, Michael. For something he doesn't even remember doing. How is that justice?" "It's not about justice right now," Michael said, his voice calm but strained. He had grown up in the shadow of scandal and the legal system. He knew its rhythms and its cruel indifference. It's about procedure. It's about evidence. We have to let John do his job. His job is to get him out, Carly snapped, but the fight was leaching out of her, replaced by a cold, gripping fear. She sank into the chair next to her son, her shoulders slumping. She thought of the life she and Drew had been planning. the quiet dinners, the shared looks over business documents, the simple, solid comfort they had found in each other. It had felt like a safe harbor after a lifetime of storms. Now, the harbor was gone, and she was adrift in the same tempest that was threatening to drown him. "He didn't do this, Michael," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Not the Drew I know." Michael put a hand on her arm. "I know, Mom. I believe that, too. But the evidence, it's bad. We have to be prepared for a long fight." The door to the interrogation room opened, and Drew emerged, his hands still cuffed in front of him, flanked by Chase and another officer. His eyes found Carly's instantly, and in that brief, unguarded moment, she saw it all, the shame, the fear, the profound exhaustion, and a flicker of something that looked like apology. Then the mask of stoicism slid back into place. "Drew!" Carly surged to her feet. "I'm okay, Carly," he said, his voice rough. "Don't worry." It was such a ridiculous thing to say that she almost laughed, a hysterical bubble of sound caught in her throat. Don't worry? Her world was collapsing. John, his lawyer, a man with a sharp suit and a sharper mind, stepped between them. "Carly, Michael. They're transferring him to the county jail. The DA is opposing bail. Given the severity of the charges and his particular skill set, they're arguing he's a flight risk." "A flight risk?" Carly exploded. "He's got a son. A business. A life here." "A life that, according to the prosecution, was built on a foundation of lies and treason," John said quietly, not unkindly. "They're going to use his military training, his history of evasion, everything. It's not looking good for a release today." Drew listened, his head bowed. This was the reality. He was no longer Drew Kane, respected businessman. He was inmate 73482, a traitor to his country. As the officers began to lead him away, he looked back at Carly one last time. "Take care of Scout," he said, and then he was gone, ushered through a heavy door that clanged shut with a sound of terrible finality. Carly stood frozen, the echo of that clang reverberating through her soul. The fight was gone, replaced by a cold, hard determination. Someone had done this. Someone had dug up this past and weaponized it. And she was going to find out who. The arraignment was a media circus. News vans lined the street outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes pointed skyward like a forest of metallic trees. Photographers jostled for position, their cameras clicking like a swarm of mechanical insects. Drew, dressed now in an ill-fitting orange jumpsuit, was led in, his expression blank, a fortress against the world. The charges were read aloud in the sterile, wood-paneled courtroom. Espionage. Aiding and abetting a known terrorist organization. Money laundering. Tax evasion. The words were heavy, legalistic, but their meaning was clear. He was being accused of the ultimate betrayal. "How does the defendant plead?" the judge asked, her voice echoing in the hushed room. Drew stood, his shoulders squared. "Not guilty, Your Honor." The plea was a formality, a necessary step in the dance. The prosecution, a sleek, ambitious attorney named Alexandra Blake, argued passionately for him to be held without bail, painting a picture of a cunning, dangerous man with the resources and the know-how to vanish into thin air. John fought back, arguing Drew's deep ties to the community, his son, his lack of a criminal record, but the weight of the evidence was too much. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for being tough on national security cases, remanded him into custody without bail. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Carly, sitting in the front row, felt the air leave her lungs. No bail. He was going to sit in a cell until the trial, which could be months, maybe a year away. As he was led out, Drew's eyes swept the room. They landed on Carly, then on Michael, on Jocelyn who had come for support, and then, unexpectedly, on Sam McCall, who was sitting in the back, her face a complex map of sympathy and confusion. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, a final gesture of connection before the abyss swallowed him whole. Life in the county jail was a study in sensory deprivation and hyper-awareness. The constant clang of doors, the murmur of voices, the stark, unyielding concrete, it was a world away from the soft linen sheets and panoramic views of his penthouse. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the psychological torment. He was placed in protective custody, isolated from the general population. A former Navy SEAL accused of treason would be a target for everyone inside. The solitude was a blessing and a curse. It gave him time to think, to rage, to despair, without having to put on a show for anyone. He replayed every moment of his life he could remember, searching for a clue, a fragment of memory that could explain the man in the photograph. After his rescue, his memory had been a Swiss cheese landscape of holes and uncertainties. He had accepted the narrative given to him. He was a hero, captured and tortured, who had never broken. He had built his identity on that foundation. Now, he was being told the foundation was rotten, that he had not just broken, but he had willingly joined the other side. Was it possible? In the dark of his cell, with only the sound of his own breathing for company, he had to confront the terrifying possibility. What if he had? What if the pressure, the torture, the psychological warfare had shattered him so completely that he had become the very thing he was fighting against? The thought was a poison, seeping into his soul. He would lie on the thin, lumpy mattress, staring at the ceiling, and wonder if the decency he felt, the love for his son, the moral compass that guided him, were they all just a brilliant, subconscious fabrication? A lie he told himself so he could sleep at night? His first visitor was Carly. She was led into a partitioned room, sitting on one side of a thick plexiglass window, he on the other. She looked tired, the strain etching new lines around her eyes, but her gaze was fierce. "We're going to fight this, Drew," she said, her voice tinny through the phone receiver. "I've hired a team of investigators. The best. We're going to tear that evidence apart." "Carly," he began, his voice hollow. "What if it's true?" "Don't," she cut him off, her eyes blazing through the glass. "Don't you dare. I know you. The man who raised Jason Morgan's son as his own. The man who stood by me through everything. That is who you are. Not some grainy photo from 20 years ago. The money, Carly. The bank records. They don't lie. People lie. Documents can be forged," she insisted. "Someone is behind this. Someone set you up. I'm going to find out who." He wanted to believe her. He clung to her faith like a lifeline. But in the silence of his cell, the doubts would creep back in. His next visitor was Sam. Her presence was more complicated. Their history was a tangled web of love, loss, and Jason Morgan. She sat down, looking uncomfortable, her fingers twisting together. "How are you holding up?" she asked, the question feeling inadequate. "As well as can be expected," he replied, managing a faint smile. "How's Scout?" "He's okay. Confused. He misses you." "We all do." She hesitated. "Drew, is there anything you remember? Anything at all that could help?" He shook his head, a gesture of profound weariness. "It's like trying to remember a dream. The harder I try, the faster it slips away. Sam, if I did these things, I need you to know. I'm so sorry." Tears welled in her eyes. "Stop it. We're not going there. We're going to prove you didn't do it." But her voice lacked Carly's fiery conviction. There was a hesitation, a shadow of the same doubt that plagued him. She had loved Jason, a man whose moral code was absolute, black and white. This gray area, this terrible uncertainty, was a place she didn't know how to navigate. The visits, while a connection to the outside world, were also a fresh hell. Each one was a reminder of everything he had lost, of the pain he was causing the people he loved. Back in Port Charles, the fallout was spreading like a stain. At Aurora Media, the board was in a panic. Stock prices were plummeting. Major advertisers were pulling their contracts. The name Kane was toxic. Michael, as a major shareholder, was fighting a desperate rearguard action to keep the company from imploding, but the calls for Drew's resignation were deafening. Carly, true to her word, had become a woman possessed. She spent her days in war rooms with lawyers and private investigators, a map of Drew's past life pinned to a large board, strings connecting names, dates, and places. She was looking for a weakness, a discrepancy, the ghost in the machine. The source of the leak, she insisted to her head investigator, a grizzled ex-cop named Marcus. It all leads back to that initial story in The Invader. Who fed it to them? We're working on it, Miss Corinthos, Marcus said, his voice a low rumble. But these things, they're like peeling an onion. The Invader protects its sources with a vengeance. We're digging, but it's slow going. Her suspicion fell, inevitably, on Nina. It was always Nina. The woman was a snake, coiled and ready to strike at any moment. But proving it was another matter. She confronted Nina at the Metro Court, a public scene that provided fodder for the gossip columns for days. You did this, Carly accused, her voice trembling with rage. You've always been jealous. You couldn't stand to see me happy. Nina, to her credit, looked genuinely shocked, a mask of innocence that Carly found utterly enraging. I have no idea what you're talking about, Carly. Yes, I think Drew is a sanctimonious hypocrite, but I didn't do this. Even I have limits. I don't believe you, Carly spat. And I will prove it. But as the days turned into weeks, no proof materialized. The case against Drew seemed airtight. The prosecution's discovery file was a mountain of damning evidence, financial records, sworn statements from former associates of Rosales who identified Drew, and the timeline that placed him squarely at the scene of the crime, conscious and complicit. The media narrative had solidified, Drew Kane was a fraud, a wolf in sheep's clothing who had fooled an entire city. The public's admiration turned to vitriol. Traitor was scrawled on the walls of his office building. Scout was teased at school. The life he had built was being systematically dismantled, brick by brick. In his cell, Drew was reaching a breaking point. The isolation, the guilt, the uncertainty were a slow-acting acid eating away at his sanity. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He spent hours just sitting on the floor, his back against the cold wall, retreating into the darkest corners of his mind. It was during one of these fugue states that a memory, sharp and sudden as a shard of glass, pierced the fog. The heat. The oppressive, humid heat of the jungle. The smell of damp earth and cordite. His body aching, his mind a scrambled mess of implanted suggestions and fractured realities. A voice, smooth as silk, speaking to him in a darkened room. You are one of us now, brother. Your old life is a lie. This is your truth. This is your purpose. He remembered the feeling of the envelope in his hand. The weight of it. Not just the physical weight, but the moral weight. He remembered the face of Armand Rosales, not as a monster from a wanted poster, but as a man, a colleague, a believer in the same twisted cause. And he remembered believing it. Wholeheartedly. He jolted back to the present, his heart hammering against his ribs, sweat soaking his jumpsuit. It wasn't a full memory, not a coherent narrative, but it was an emotion, a visceral, terrifying sense of conviction. In that moment, in that past, he had not been a prisoner. He had been a convert. The revelation was worse than any torture. Carly, Sam, Michael, they were fighting for a man who didn't exist. They were believing in a phantom. The person who had done those things wasn't a stranger, he was a version of himself he had buried, a version that had been created in a lab of pain and psychological manipulation, but a version of himself nonetheless. When Carly visited next, he was a different man. The last flicker of hope in his eyes was gone, replaced by a bleak acceptance. I remember something, he said, his voice flat. Carly leaned forward, her face alight with anticipation. What? Drew, what is it? Tell me. I remember believing, he said, the words tasting like ash. I remember handing him that envelope and feeling purpose. I wasn't a prisoner, Carly. I was a willing participant. She stared at him, her face crumbling from hope to disbelief to denial. No. That's not true. It's the memory mapping, it's faulty, it's... It's the truth, he interrupted, his voice firmer now. I can feel it. The man in that photo, that's me. The real me. Stop it, she cried, her voice cracking. I don't accept that. You were brainwashed. You were tortured. That doesn't make you guilty. In the eyes of the law, it does, he said softly. And in my own eyes, it might, too. It was the first time he had seen Carly truly broken. The fight went out of her, and she just looked lost, a little girl in a storm. She left soon after, and Drew knew a chasm had opened between them that might never be bridged. Her faith was based on his innocence, and he had just confessed his guilt. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected quarter. As the preliminary hearing approached, John was meticulously going through the prosecution's evidence for the 1,000th time. He was focused on the bank records, the transfers from Rosales to Drew's Shell Corporation. The account numbers, the routing information, the dates. It was all so clean, so perfect. And that was the problem. In his experience, nothing from the shadowy world of international espionage and illicit finance was ever this clean. There were always anomalies, quirks, tiny errors. This was pristine. It was as if someone had created the perfect digital paper trail, a work of fiction designed to be believed. He brought in a new expert, a hacker-turned-security consultant named Nix, a woman who saw code the way Mozart saw music. She spent 3 days living in John's office, surrounded by empty coffee cups and computer screens filled with cascading lines of green text. On the 4th day, she found it. A ghost in the machine. A single, tiny timestamp error in the metadata of the original bank transfer file. A server in Switzerland had recorded the transaction a fraction of a second before a server in the Cayman Islands, an impossibility given the way the international banking network was configured. It was a mistake only someone who didn't understand the deep, architectural logic of the system would make. The entire financial edifice of the case against Drew Kane was a forgery. A brilliant, nearly flawless forgery, but a forgery nonetheless. John immediately filed a motion to dismiss, presenting the new evidence. The news hit the DA's office like an earthquake. Alexandra Blake was furious, her case suddenly in tatters. The judge, faced with evidence of tampering on this scale, had no choice. The financial charges, the very backbone of the prosecution's timeline, were thrown out. Without the money trail, the case collapsed. The grainy photo was still damning, but it was no longer supported by incontrovertible proof of profit. The testimony of Rosales' associates was now suspect, likely bought and paid for. The judge, looking deeply unhappy, had no choice. She granted bail. Drew walked out of the county jail a free man, for now. The sun was blinding, the air shockingly fresh. He stood on the steps, squinting, as a crowd of reporters shouted questions. Carly was there, waiting for him, her face a mixture of triumph and caution. Michael and Jocelyn stood behind her. He was free, but he was not cleared. The espionage charge still hung over him, a sword of Damocles. And while the world now knew the evidence was tainted, the shadow of doubt remained. He was no longer a convicted traitor, but he was a suspected one. The stain on his name was merely faded, not erased. And the biggest question of all remained, who? Who had the resources, the knowledge, and the motive to fabricate such an elaborate and devastating frame-up? Who hated Drew Kane enough to try and annihilate him so completely? As he got into the car with Carly, leaving the shouting reporters behind, he knew the fight was far from over. The battle in the courtroom may have been won, but the war for his name, his past, and his very soul was just beginning. The terrible secret had been exposed, but a greater, more dangerous secret was still hidden in the shadows of Port Charles, the identity of the puppet master who had pulled the strings, and the reason why they wanted Drew Kane destroyed. Drew had felt the walls closing in on him for days, but nothing prepared him for the moment the PCPD stormed into the Quartermain mansion with an urgency that sent everyone's heart racing. Olivia had been in the foyer arranging flowers when the door burst open, officers rushing past her before she could even gasp. What on earth, she managed before Anna stepped inside behind them, her expression stone-cold, her voice grim as she called out, Drew Kane, we need you to come with us. Ned and Brooklyn exchanged confused, almost horrified looks as Drew stepped out of the living room with a stiff posture that suggested he had been expecting this but praying it wouldn't come. "Anna, what's going on?" he asked quietly, hands halfway raised as if he knew what was next. "You're under arrest," Anna said, her words slicing through the room. "For obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and withholding evidence in an ongoing federal investigation." Gasps filled the hallway as an officer took Drew's wrists and snapped the cuffs around them. "Mom, what is happening?" Scout cried as Sam hurried her back, shielding her from the chaos. "Drew, this has to be a mistake," Carly said, stepping forward, her voice wavering even as she tried to appear strong. Drew only shook his head slightly. "It's not a mistake," he murmured, more to her than to anyone else. As they let him out, the terrible secret that had been hanging over him finally erupted into the open. Drew had known the truth about a massive corporate cover-up involving a high-powered defense contractor, one that implicated a handful of high-ranking officials. And the worst part was that he had kept it hidden, believing he was protecting someone he cared for deeply. Once they reached the PCPD, the mood shifted from stunned shock to grim realization. Inside the interrogation room, Anna sat opposite Drew, a file thick with documents in her hands. "You had every opportunity to come forward," she said, voice low but intense. "Why didn't you?" Drew exhaled slowly, the weight of everything he'd been protecting pressing down on him. "Because the truth would have destroyed her," he said quietly. "I wasn't going to let that happen." Anna narrowed her eyes. "Her? Carly?" she asked bluntly. Drew shook his head. "No. Someone else." Anna studied him for long moments, then leaned forward. "You do understand that by hiding this information, you may have put countless lives at risk." Drew swallowed, his voice rough as he replied, "I thought I could fix it before it spiraled out of control." Back at the mansion, the fallout spread like wildfire. Michael stood in the living room pacing, jaw clenched tight. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. Willow placed a hand on his arm. "Michael, you need to breathe." But he was already dialing someone. "I'm calling Diane. We need answers." Sonny arrived minutes later, expression unreadable as usual, but the tension in his shoulders said he was anything but calm. "Where is everyone?" he demanded.